So, good morning. Good to see everyone. Often I want to talk this morning about an awakened life. And often when we hear that term, folks think, we're spacing out or we're walking around in some altered state of consciousness all the time or it's some real dramatic, flashy thing. But in fact, I'm going to suggest this morning that it's not. And I want to talk a little bit about some writings attributed to Shantideva, who was an 8th century Indian monk, philosopher, Buddhist scholar, etc. And his life, as we understand, it's just sort of been patched together from different stories, different folks that have documented his life, but the details of that are really less important than the lessons that are conveyed in his life. It's not a precise biography, but all that said, it really does um, kind of set the stage for some really brilliant teaching on his part. And when you read about his life, you'll see that other monks thought he was lazy, that he only ate, slept, and did not much else, which is really an exaggerated caricature, but for some reason that's how he was seen. But the message there is that it speaks to this human condition, this idea that we often see ourselves just drifting through life on autopilot, doing everything we can to avoid discomfort, seek pleasure, conserve our energy, just doing enough to get by and so forth. And that's sort of the caricature of Shanti Deva um, in the 8th century. But but the legend tells us that because he was annoyed by this caricature, uh, he, they conspired to embarrass him. They called him to the lectern in this great hall at Nalanda University back then, and that was sort of the seat of a lot of Buddhist thought in the 8th century, and it was really the sort of intellectual ground zero of that part of the world. And he was asked to lecture there, and it was sort of a setup. They were doing this to kind of embarrass him and show that he really didn't have anything profound to say. And and yet um, it really went in an unexpected direction, which is why I love this story. Because instead of faltering, instead of embarrassing himself, he sat calmly on the dais and asked whether the assembled folks wanted something old or new. And they said, no, 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 Shantideva, please give us something new. Please share your wisdom. And what followed was this text, which has now been memorialized and preserved, called How to Lead an Awakened Life. And it turns out, being, even in its translation, one of the clearest, most loved guides to cultivating ethical clarity, mental discipline, and really universal compassion. um, and then the legend goes on that he concludes the lecture and then he just rises up in the sky and disappears. One of these beautiful kind of myths. But he left behind the text and this companion anthology that he had compiled of Buddhist teachings to that date. Now, whether this happened doesn't really matter. I assume it probably didn't. But what's important is that it makes the point that wisdom and the teachings are not always obvious and visible on the surface. And it also points to the value of humility. The danger of premature judgment of others. We see people as disengaged, as not really doing much, but it also prepares us for the message of his text. And the key point here that Sanchi Deva leaves us with is that transformation begins with turning inward. And that was a more radical concept then than it is now, because certainly that was true for monks, but he was sort of spreading it more broadly. And that working on the causes of suffering within us can lessen the suffering around us. Working on our own sources of suffering can lessen the suffering around. We talked about that recently. But this is what he's talking about as an awakened life. It's valued not really just for its poetic beauty, but for its practical guidance. And that's what hooked me, because I'm all about practical Dharma. And it's striking in my review of it. And I had to revisit it. I hadn't seen it in a while. It's striking in its simplicity. The world contains, we don't have, I don't have to tell you, immense suffering. And if we wish to alleviate it or contribute to reducing it, we must become people who do that effectively. And his argument is compassion alone is not enough. Good intentions alone are not enough. We also need to cultivate steady minds, open hearts, ethical sensitivity, and the patience, that fundamental um, thing that the Buddha taught, that first of the paramitas, to skillfully implement all of this. Okay. And this really circles back to that bodhisattva ideal, that not as a mystical being, but as a model for how we live with purpose and care in this world. Okay. The bodhisattva's commitment is to resolve to awaken for the benefit of all beings. The more present we are with an open heart, with compassion, the more it benefits those around us. Now, this is a more sort of traditional Mahayana concept in Buddhism, but it's the decision not to escape just into our personal serenity, not to just do this practice for our own sake, but to remain in the world with the fruits of our practice, where we develop wisdom and compassion so completely that we can be of real help to those around us. So what does this look like in modern secular terms? It really, to my view, looks like a commitment to become a more responsible, emotionally balanced, and beneficial version of ourselves. Not solely out of self-improvement, not solely to reduce our own suffering, but because we're all interconnected and our actions matter because they impact others. Okay. This resolve is rooted in care, the concept of care, karuna, the commitment to relieve or try to relieve suffering wherever we bump into it. Now, we talk about this sort of tangentially all the time. It's a concept I think most of us certainly understand intuitively. When we see someone hurting, there's a natural inclination to want to help. I mean, we have to be wise about this because sometimes we can get in there and make things worse. But there is that natural tendency to want to help others that are suffering. And so the challenge in our everyday lives is that our capacity to help is often limited by our reactivity. And boy, I speak personally on this: impatience, our fears, our confusion. We hold back. We don't want to overextend. We don't want to overstep, and so forth. But Shantideva's teaching in this treatise that he wrote, attributed to him anyway, is aimed at reducing those inner obstacles, as is our path aimed at reducing these inner obstacles. But he begins this by urging us to recognize the urgency of our moral and psychological development. He says life is short. We don't know how long our health, our clarity, or our circumstances will last, so that every day passes is an unused day that can't be regained. Not as a threat, not as a wake-up call, but remembering, that this is very practical. This is very pragmatic. It protects us from wasting time. It advises us not to waste time on trivialities. It helps us focus, set an intention to focus on what really matters. We spend years thinking about becoming better people, right? Kinder, calmer, more patient, more generous. But there's a gap there between thinking that and wanting to be that and doing something about it. And he speaks directly to that gap, to this human tendency. He says reflection is important. That's where we learn about where we want to take ourselves. But without action, it really doesn't amount to anything. We can reflect all we want, but if we don't step into the river, it doesn't amount to much. He's reminding us that every opportunity to grow and change is available right now. When we talk in a few minutes, when we go out into the world today, it's available. Not in some ideal future when our lives are finally all together and with some sort of perfect order. Okay. He highlights the value of current circumstances. The fact that we are alive, the fact that we are conscious, the fact that we are mentally capable every day of examining our lives. And he says, what a rare blessing this is to our species. We have enough stability to read, reflect, to sit quietly. It's significant because out of that we can take skillful action. Rather than taking these conditions for granted, he urges us to treat them as precious resources. If we squander them, we don't get to go back and get a do-over. Because illness and hardship and crises and can arrive at any time unexpectedly. In his teaching, in his context, this motivation was tied to the whole notion of karma and rebirth. But we can reframe that as that actions have consequences that unfold in this lifetime. And the person who experiences the fruits of our choices could be thought of as our future self, down the road. I've made good choices now. That's going to inform my life going forward. Okay. So he's saying that every action we take, every word we speak, every habit we reinforce creates consequences that shape the world long after we are gone. This is this whole notion of causes and consequences and spreading like a net. Okay. So, for instance, how we heat our homes affects the climate inherited by future generations. How we relate to other people influences perhaps their emotional resilience down the road. How we engage politically shapes the culture and society in which our descendants live. On and on and on. It's not just what we're doing today for ourselves and those around us. What is it going to do down the road? And in this framework of karma, if you want to use that term, is the recognition that nothing we do occurs in isolation. Our choices ripple outward all the time, and we need to remain cognizant of this. This recognition naturally leads to a sense of responsibility. Because when we clearly see that our actions influence the broader world, it's harder to justify and live with decisions and choices that are careless and unskillful or even harmful. Because we see that we're part of this larger net of causes and conditions, of cause and effect. So he's telling us if we truly wish to create a better world, and here he's again referencing what he calls the awakened life, we start by transforming the patterns of thought and behavior within ourselves that we come to understand cause harm. We work with our minds to shift that. We learn to pause before reacting, something we talk about here all the time, because we understand that frustration and anger creates a negative ripple effect. We practice patience to the best of our ability in every moment. I had a couple moments of impatience this week that brought this right in the front of me. We become aware of our biases, our assumptions, our judgments, and we spend time cultivating gratitude. We cultivate generosity deliberately with intention. We avoid speech that harms and divides. We make decisions, and this is a little bit of a shift, with long-term consequences in mind. How is this going to play out down the road, maybe when I'm long gone? Because we take responsibility for the impact of our actions. We don't sit around blaming others, pointing fingers. We take responsibility. What is my role in all this? Not in some sort of mystical, supernatural way, but in concrete, formal, daily, practical ways that we talk about here all the time. Our habits change in the way we start to change the habits in the ways we show up to the world. We seek to become steadier, more trustworthy, more capable of offering real support. This path is just not about our own self-improvement. As we become more grounded, our ability to act more compassionately increases naturally. Shantideva's text reminds us, and it remains so important because it speaks directly to this possibility. It's just one of the classics in Buddhist literature. It reminds us that ethical development is not about being perfect. It's not about achieving sainthood. It's about becoming someone, and we've talked about this recently, who reduces harm, who increases well-being, because that's the kind of energy that we send into the world. It's gradual, it's sometimes subtle, but the effects are cumulative. Each small step, each moment of clarity, each act of patience, each act of kindness contributes to this life that's aligned with these goals. So his message, even though it originated in the 8th century, it really transcends historical, cultural, and even religious boundaries. It's a pretty universal message. It's found in many faith traditions. And whether we believe in rebirth or see life as a single finite span, the truth is the same. I mean, it doesn't change how we approach all these questions. We know that in this life, whether it's the only one we get or one of many, our time is limited, our influence is real, and our responsibility, I would suggest, is great. We have this opportunity to awaken. And as I said at the outset, not in some grand sort of shift of consciousness, but in the way that he describes it, living the life that he describes, to become a person whose presence is beneficial, but that presence is available only during this brief and precious life, as far as we know. He's telling us across centuries not to wait. Don't wait and put it off till tomorrow. The world desperately cries out for compassion now. And we are fortunate in that we have right now the chance to cultivate that compassion. So those are some thoughts from Shantideva on the 8th century on living what he called an awakened life.